It's Saturday morning, and you finally get the thing you've been telling yourself you needed all week. No alarm. You sleep until 9, maybe 9:30, and for a second, lying there in the extra light coming through the blinds, it feels like a genuine win. Then you actually get up, and something feels off in a way that doesn't match the math. You slept longer than you did all week. You should feel rested. Instead you feel foggy, a little heavy behind the eyes, oddly more tired than the mornings you dragged yourself up at 6:15 for work. You blame it on a bad pillow, or the extra glass of wine the night before, and you move on with your day. I'm not going to tell you that sleeping in is lazy or that you need to set an alarm on weekends out of sheer discipline, because that's not actually the problem, and you already know discipline isn't what's missing here. The real reason you feel worse after more sleep has almost nothing to do with how many hours you got and almost everything to do with a hormone that was supposed to be rising sharply through your bloodstream hours before you ever opened your eyes, and instead spent that entire window waiting for a signal that never arrived on schedule. Before I explain exactly what that hormone is doing while you sleep and why the clock matters more than the hour count, I want to show you the actual research, because if I just told you sleeping past 7 disrupts your cortisol rhythm, you'd assume that was an arbitrary number picked to sound alarming. It isn't arbitrary, and once you see the mechanism behind it, you're going to think about your alarm clock completely differently. Cortisol has a reputation problem. Most people have only ever heard the word attached to the phrase stress hormone, which makes it sound like something you'd want as little of as possible, as often as possible. That framing misses almost the entire actual story. Cortisol follows one of the most precisely engineered daily rhythms in the entire human body, rising and falling on a schedule that has nothing to do with how stressed you are and everything to do with what time it is. In a person on a normal, stable sleep schedule, cortisol begins climbing in your bloodstream in the final hours of sleep, well before you consciously wake up, then surges sharply again in the 30 to 45 minutes immediately after waking, a specific, well-documented spike researchers call the cortisol awakening response. That morning surge isn't a stress reaction. It's closer to your body's ignition sequence, mobilizing glucose, sharpening alertness, and priming your metabolism and immune system for the demands of the day ahead, time to arrive right as you're supposed to be getting out of bed. Researchers studying this rhythm have found something specific and, once you understand it, genuinely unsettling about what happens when that timing gets disrupted. The size and sharpness of that morning cortisol surge isn't fixed to a random internal clock ticking away independent of your behavior. It's tightly locked to your actual light exposure and wake timing, particularly to when the retina first registers a meaningful jump in brightness after a period of darkness. Studies measuring cortisol awakening response across people with consistent versus irregular wake times have found that when wake time drifts later and later, especially past the point where a person's body has already been anticipating a wake-up based on days or weeks of prior timing, the resulting cortisol surge tends to come out blunted, smaller, and less sharply defined than the surge measured on days with earlier, more consistent wake times. You didn't just sleep in. You asked your adrenal system to fire its most important signal of the entire day on a schedule it wasn't prepared for, and it answered with a weaker version of the response it was supposed to deliver. There's a second, related body of research worth putting right next to that finding. A concept researchers call social jet lag, essentially the gap between the sleep schedule your body is biologically anchored to during the work week and the drastically shifted schedule most people adopt on weekends, has been studied extensively by circadian researchers over the last 2 decades, and the associations that keep showing up are not subtle. People with larger social jet lag, meaning a bigger weekend shift in sleep and wake timing compared to their weekday schedule, consistently show worse metabolic markers, higher rates of reported fatigue, and in several large population studies, measurably higher body mass index and higher likelihood of reporting poor overall health, even after accounting for total sleep duration. Total hours of sleep, in other words, wasn't the variable driving the difference. The consistency, or lack of it, in when those hours happened was doing most of the work. Hold those two things side by side. A precisely timed morning cortisol surge that depends on consistent wake timing to fire correctly, and a large, independently replicated body of research showing that shifting your wake time later, even while getting equal or more total sleep, tracks with worse metabolic and health outcomes. Those facts sitting together should feel strange in the same way it felt strange that a joint nobody checks could predict lifespan, or that a valve losing tone could explain reflux that got blamed on dinner for years. It isn't that extra sleep is bad for you. It's that one specific hormonal signal, timed with genuine precision to fire around your usual wake window, gets systematically weakened every time that window drifts, and almost nobody has ever explained to you that the timing, not the total hours, is what that signal actually depends on. Here's the reframe that matters, because a title built around a specific hour can easily be misread, and I want to correct that misreading directly before we go any further. There's nothing biologically special about the number 7 itself. Your body doesn't have a hardwired rule that says wake before 7 a.m. or suffer the consequences. What matters is consistency and light timing relative to your own established rhythm, not a universal clock hour that applies identically to everyone regardless of their normal schedule. Someone who reliably wakes at 5:30 every single day and sleeps in until 7 on a Saturday has shifted their wake time later by 90 minutes relative to their own baseline, and that shift is what disrupts the signal, the same disruption someone who normally wakes at 8:30 would experience sleeping in until 10. The number 7 works as a useful, relatable marker in this title because it happens to sit close to the average habitual wake time for a huge share of working adults, which means for most people watching this, sleeping meaningfully past their own normal wake window does functionally land somewhere around that hour. But the actual mechanism this video is about is timing consistency and light exposure relative to your body's expectation, not a fixed number stamped onto every person's biology identically. Let's walk through the actual mechanics of how this system works, because once you see it clearly, you'll understand exactly why an inconsistent wake time creates a weaker signal than a late but consistent one would. Your master body clock lives in a tiny cluster of neurons in your brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, sitting just above where your optic nerves cross, positioned exactly where it can directly receive signals from specialized light-sensing cells in your retina that respond specifically to the kind of bright, blue-shifted light present in morning daylight. That master clock doesn't run your body's rhythms directly. Instead, it acts like a conductor, sending timing signals out to a whole network of smaller, semi-independent clocks located in individual organs and tissues throughout your body, including, critically, your adrenal glands, the small structures sitting on top of your kidneys that actually manufacture and release cortisol. Your adrenal glands carry their own local clock genes, genuinely functioning molecular timing machinery inside the cells themselves, which gate exactly how sensitive those cells are to the pituitary signal telling them to release cortisol at any given moment. Think of the suprachiasmatic nucleus as a conductor holding up a baton, and your adrenal clock as a musician who has been rehearsing the exact moment to come in based on where that baton has been pointing for the last several days. When the baton's position, your actual light-anchored wake time, has been landing in roughly the same place morning after morning, the musician comes in confidently, right on cue, with full volume. When the baton suddenly jumps to a completely different position, a much later wake time than the adrenal clock had been rehearsing for, the musician either comes in late, comes in quieter than intended, or comes in a little out of sync with where the rest of the orchestra actually is. That's the cortisol awakening response getting blunted. Not because anything is broken, but because the adrenal clock's rehearsed timing and your actual behavior stopped matching each other for that particular morning, and the surge that depends on those two things lining up came out weaker as a direct, measurable result. This isn't a problem unique to people with chaotic, unpredictable schedules. It's baked into a few extremely ordinary patterns most adults live inside without ever questioning them, and once you see them laid out, you'll likely recognize your own week in more than one. The first is the weekday-weekend split itself. Working a fixed schedule Monday through Friday and then sleeping in significantly on Saturday and Sunday is one of the most common and most thoroughly studied sources of social jet lag in the entire research literature, precisely because it creates a genuinely large, repeated, twice-weekly shift in wake timing, followed by an abrupt snap back to the earlier schedule on Monday morning. Your adrenal clock, and the broader network of peripheral clocks throughout your body, don't fully re-entrain to a new schedule in a single weekend. They partially adjust, then get yanked back, over and over, week after week, essentially never settling into one stable rehearsed rhythm at all. The second is inconsistent morning light exposure, which compounds the timing problem directly. Even on days when wake time itself is reasonably consistent, spending the first hour after waking in a dim bedroom, behind blackout curtains, or immediately staring at a phone screen a few inches from your face rather than getting genuine bright light into your eyes, weakens the actual signal your suprachiasmatic nucleus is trying to send downstream in the first place. The system isn't just tracking clock time. It's specifically tracking a jump in brightness hitting the retina at a consistent point relative to your sleep-wake cycle, and a wake-up that happens without that brightness signal arriving promptly is, from your body's perspective, a weaker, less convincing wake-up regardless of what the clock on the wall says. The third is the snooze button, which sounds trivial compared to the first two but genuinely interferes with the same mechanism in a smaller, more frequent way. Hitting snooze repeatedly fragments the final stretch of sleep into short, broken segments, each one interrupted by a jolt of alarm-triggered arousal followed by a rapid drop back toward sleep. That fragmented pattern disrupts the smooth, gradually building final rise in cortisol that's supposed to be happening naturally in the last hour or two of a normal sleep cycle, replacing one clean ascending curve with several smaller, choppier spikes and dips that don't add up to the same clean signal a single, uninterrupted wake-up would produce. Stack those three things together: a repeated weekly whiplash between weekday and weekend timing, morning light exposure that arrives late, dim, or not at all, and a snooze habit fragmenting the final approach to waking, and you get exactly the pattern researchers keep documenting. A hormonal signal engineered with real biological precision, quietly weakened week after week by three extremely ordinary habits almost nobody thinks to connect to it. I want to walk through the real chain of consequences here honestly, because the stakes extend meaningfully beyond one foggy Saturday morning. A properly timed, robust cortisol awakening response does more than just help you feel alert. It plays a genuine role in regulating blood sugar handling through the first part of the day, supporting immune function, and helping set the tone for the rest of your daily cortisol rhythm, which is supposed to decline gradually and predictably from that morning peak down to its lowest point around midnight. Researchers studying what's called diurnal cortisol slope, essentially how sharply and cleanly cortisol falls from its morning high to its overnight low, have found that a flatter, less pronounced slope, one where the morning peak never really gets sharp and the whole rhythm sits closer to a flat line throughout the day, shows up repeatedly as a marker associated with worse health outcomes across a range of studies, including some notable research on cancer patients where a flatter diurnal cortisol slope was associated with meaningfully worse survival outcomes, independent of disease stage. That specific finding, from research published decades ago and replicated in various forms since, is part of why circadian researchers take this rhythm as seriously as they do rather than treating it as a minor wellness detail. Beyond that, chronic circadian misalignment, the broader category of disruption that includes repeatedly shifted wake timing, has been linked in a substantial body of research to worse glucose regulation, higher rates of reported anxiety and depressive symptoms, and increased markers of systemic inflammation. Some of this connects back to cortisol's normal role as a natural anti-inflammatory signal in the early part of the day. When that morning peak is blunted, the inflammatory dampening effect it normally provides arrives weaker too, leaving a slightly larger inflammatory baseline to carry through the rest of the day, day after day, which is one of the mechanisms researchers point to when trying to explain why chronic circadian misalignment keeps showing up alongside markers of low-grade systemic inflammation in blood work, independent of diet or exercise habits. None of this means one weekend of sleeping in causes lasting harm, and it's important to be honest about that distinction. It's the chronic, repeated, week-after-week pattern of misalignment that the research actually connects to those broader outcomes, the same way one missed protein-rich meal doesn't undo a year of good training, but a consistent pattern of missing that window repeatedly does add up to something measurable over time. Here's where I need to be direct, the same way I've been through this entire video. The fix here genuinely isn't complicated, and it doesn't require giving up sleeping in forever. It requires narrowing the gap between your weekday and weekend wake times, and making sure that whatever wake time you do land on is met with real light exposure promptly, rather than treating the entire concept as an all-or-nothing discipline exercise. The single most effective change is limiting how far your weekend wake time drifts from your weekday one, ideally keeping that gap under about an hour. That doesn't mean setting a jarring alarm on Saturday. It means allowing yourself to wake naturally, without an alarm, but going to bed at a consistent enough time that natural waking tends to land within roughly an hour of your weekday schedule rather than 2 or 3 hours later. This single adjustment is the direct countermeasure to the social jet lag research discussed earlier, and it's consistently the variable most strongly associated with better outcomes in that body of research, more than total sleep duration on its own. Morning light exposure matters just as much as the wake time itself. Getting outside, or at minimum near a bright window, within the first 30 to 60 minutes of waking, for even 5 to 10 minutes, gives your suprachiasmatic nucleus the clear, unambiguous brightness signal it's actually looking for to confidently set the rest of the day's rhythm in motion. On a bright day, this happens easily just stepping outside briefly. On a dark winter morning, opening blinds and turning on genuinely bright indoor lighting immediately upon waking, rather than sitting in dim light while checking your phone, accomplishes a meaningful portion of the same signal. And retiring the snooze button, or at minimum limiting yourself to 1 press rather than 5, protects that final smooth stretch of pre-waking cortisol rise from getting fragmented into a series of smaller, choppier spikes. If getting up immediately when an alarm sounds feels genuinely difficult, that's often a sign the alarm itself is set earlier than your actual sleep need allows for, which points toward adjusting bedtime rather than relying on repeated snoozing to bridge the gap. One more piece worth naming, because it explains why this whole system responds faster to consistency than most people expect. Peripheral clocks like the one in your adrenal glands don't need weeks to re-entrain to a steadier schedule. Research on circadian realignment generally finds meaningful improvement within just a few days to a week of holding a more consistent wake and light routine, which means this isn't a change that requires months of discipline before you notice anything different. A stretch of 5 or 6 consecutive mornings with a similar wake time and prompt light exposure is often enough to start producing a noticeably sharper, more reliable cortisol awakening response, which is part of why people who make this change tend to report feeling the difference in energy and mood well before any of the longer-term outcomes discussed above would ever show up on a lab test. You've probably heard the confident claim that sleep is simply a bank account, that what matters is total hours banked across the week, and that sleeping in on weekends is a harmless, even beneficial way to pay back a debt accumulated during a shorter week. For total sleep duration in isolation, there's some truth buried in that framing. Chronic short sleep genuinely does carry real costs worth addressing. But the research on social jet lag specifically tested this exact claim, comparing people who caught up on total sleep hours through large weekend shifts against people with more consistent timing and similar total hours, and consistently found that the catch-up group still showed worse metabolic and mood outcomes tied specifically to the size of that weekend shift, not just to how many hours they'd slept overall. Total sleep matters. But treating it as the only variable that matters, while ignoring when those hours actually happen relative to your body's established rhythm, misses half of what the actual research has been measuring this whole time. I don't want to oversell this, because doing so would undercut everything true I've said so far. One late wake-up, one messy weekend, one jet-lagged trip, none of that meaningfully damages your long-term health on its own, and treating every single sleep-in as an emergency would create exactly the kind of anxious relationship with sleep that tends to backfire and make sleep worse overall. This is about the difference between an occasional shift and a chronic, repeated pattern that never lets your adrenal clock settle into a stable rhythm at all. And if you work rotating shifts, have a diagnosed circadian rhythm disorder, or deal with chronic insomnia, the advice here about consistent timing still applies in principle, but the specifics of how to implement it safely are genuinely worth working through with a doctor or a sleep specialist rather than generalizing directly from a video built around a typical daytime work schedule. Think back to that groggy, slightly heavy feeling after sleeping in, the one that never quite matched the extra hours on the clock. It was never really about how much sleep you got that night. It was a hormonal signal, engineered with genuine precision to fire around your body's established wake window, arriving late, quieter, and less sharply defined than it was designed to, simply because the light and the timing it depends on showed up somewhere your adrenal clock wasn't rehearsed to expect it. Picture what's actually on the other side of getting this right. It isn't giving up your weekends or setting a punishing alarm every single day of your life. It's a morning surge that arrives sharp and on schedule, setting a cleaner, more predictable rhythm for the entire day that follows it, whether that day starts at 6 or at 8, because it's consistent rather than because it hit any specific number on a clock. It's fewer groggy mornings that don't make sense on paper, and a rhythm that's actually allowed to settle into the stable, rehearsed pattern it was built to run on. The rhythm was never broken, and the extra sleep was never really the problem. It was a signal that kept getting asked to fire on a schedule that shifted out from under it, week after week, without anyone ever explaining what that shifting was actually costing. Now you know exactly what your cortisol is doing while you sleep, and exactly what it needs from you to do its job properly.